Alright, this is Unit 5, Video 4, and then this one we're going to look at the Freedmen's Bureau as well as some constitutional amendments that went into effect during Reconstruction. So the first thing is the Freedmen's Bureau. In March of 1865, so just before the war actually ends, Congress created, the official name is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, but typically it's referred to as just the Freedmen's Bureau. Um, but if they use this term on your test or your EOC, just bureau and freedmen are all are both in that kind of long title there. So understand it's the same thing as the Freedmen's Bureau. The goal was to help transition freed slaves from enslavement to freedom, and it also tried to assist a large number of homeless whites as well who had been displaced by this war. One of the greatest areas of success for the Bureau really came in the form of public education, and it brought education to about 200,000 blacks, which was a major improvement from any time obviously before the Civil War. Now, most people that were helped by the Bureau were black. There were some whites and even Native Americans that received food rations and clothing. And so this is a notice here on the right in Louisiana about how people can get aid. And its biggest failure, though, the Freedmen's Bureau, and really the probably the biggest failure of Reconstruction as a whole, was the inability to help freed slaves obtain land. And without their own land, they were really dependent on landowners for a job, and that really is going to cause problems for the foreseeable future. Here you see a freedman school as it's titled. You can maybe read that out there. But this was one of the examples of bringing education to the South specifically for these freed slaves. So how did the Freedmen's Bureau impact freed Africans in the South? So as we said, the biggest way obviously was education, but they also helped them, try and find jobs and homes, shelter, clothing, medical care, things that they didn't think about while they were enslaved. They didn't have any of those luxuries to think about, and so after they gained their freedom, this was an attempt to help them in any of those ways. So let's talk about the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery in the United States, and it was adopted in 1865. So this, made null and void all provisions for slavery that were in the original Constitution. So if you think all the way back to, it was probably Unit 2 when we talked about the Constitution, we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise. So this canceled the Three-Fifths Compromise because it obviously freed, everyone. So it included a clause requiring runaway slaves. This included the clause requiring runaway slaves to be returned to their owners, and the Three-Fifths Compromise as well. 13th Amendment, no slavery in the United States. So how did the 13th Amendment to the Constitution impact African Americans? Obviously, it made slavery illegal, and outlawed it for the entire country, specifically African Americans in the South. But this would also ensure future generations that would not have to be enslaved as well. The 14th Amendment, a little more complex than the 13th, and it was adopted in 1868. It declares that all people born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, and it meant that all former slaves were indeed citizens of the United States. With that said, they could enjoy equal protection of the laws, that states must protect the rights of all citizens, and they also got due process of law. So this was a big achievement for the country as a whole. And today it's one of the most widely cited amendments to fight discrimination of any kind, really, not just race. We also have the 15th Amendment, which allows black males the right to vote. And it says the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged, which means, shortened in any way, by the U.S. or any state. And that was important as well, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it was adopted in 1869. And many southern states worked to find loopholes to keep blacks from voting with things like poll taxes and literacy tests. So in some states you had to pay a tax to vote, or you had to prove that you could interpret parts of the Constitution, which would be difficult for probably a lot of us today. But certainly it would be difficult for African Americans to do that. since they were not allowed to be taught to even read or write leading up to the Civil War. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments together, we grouped those together and called them the Reconstruction Amendments. Here's a picture of a African American who is voting. It's not a private, it's not an anonymous ballot here, the system they used. So 14th Amendment here, your question, how did that impact African Americans? It made them citizens. They were not second-class citizens according to the Constitution. Now in practice, that didn't always pan out the way it was supposed to and intended, but it did guarantee them citizenship and due process of law, which was a gain despite it being shortened in states. And then also your question asks, how did the 15th Amendment impact African Americans? It gives them a political voice. Again, many states will kind of abridge these rights. They will curtail them to a degree, a large degree, in a lot of southern states especially, but it did officially give them the right to vote and say that it could not be based off of race.